Hello and welcome to week 4 of Mass Media and Politics, where the topic of this week is the impact of changing media. So focusing on how developments in the technology of media and the creation of new mediums, such as cable and internet, have impacted some of the things we discussed in past weeks, such as knowledge, learning, selective exposure, and getting a sense of how new technology has impacted American politics. To start things off, pulling from Marcus Pryor's book, I didn't have you read the first chapter of the two chapters that kind of go broadcast and cable and television. I just had you read the latter. So just to kind of catch up, during the era of broadcast television, particularly after World War II, television quickly overcame radio and newspapers and was found in almost every home, essentially. And as we discussed with some of the law and legal stuff in the first week, the FCC regulated broadcast television. Because remember, there's only a very narrow band of spectrum that you can broadcast over. And so the FCC made it that if these networks wanted to broadcast on one of those spectrums, they had to provide news and public affairs as part of its programming. And so they did. And as I talked about before, this news was not expected to make money. It was lost leaders. In other words, it didn't make money, but it became a way that the channels could draw people in by developing a good reputation. On the consumer side of things, a lot of people watched the news because there wasn't anything else on. There was a very small number of options in terms of the channels. And because of these FCC requirements and the need to appeal to a mass audience, the content across channels was also relatively similar. So if you watched NBC and turned it to ABC, you'd have very similar programming. The news would be on at similar times, things like that. But a lot of people watch television just as entertainment. They watched an entertainment show, they'd probably stick around and watch the news. And so there was very similar levels of knowledge between high interest and low interest people. As we kind of talked about last week with the conditional learning stuff, however, the rise of cable and internet have dramatically increased the amount of choices that people have in terms of entertainment. Some people thought the internet could be a knowledge leveler, that because the internet makes it easy to get information, it's low cost, that would be a way to sort of level off the knowledge and that everybody who should have similar knowledge. Instead, between cable television's expansion of choice and the internet providing a whole lot of new ways for entertainment, people who are low in interest in politics stopped paying attention to politics. Like I said, I think the other week, if you're not interested in politics, you can just change the channel. You don't have to watch the CNN or MSNBC or Fox. You can watch Food Network or Travel Channel or CMT or Comedy Central, whatever entertainment choice you want. And so this has led to a difference in knowledge between high interest and low interest people. One thing that could help a little, however, is that social media has the potential for incidental exposure. In other words, even if you personally aren't interested in politics, if someone within your social network is, and they are sharing information, you might get exposed to it anyway. Maybe not to the levels of if you were truly interested, but a friend might share an article about politics and you read it because it catches your interest. And so incidental exposure might be one way, as long as people aren't creating their social networks in a way to either avoid political information or they're creating them in a way to avoid counter-attitudinal information with the selective exposure and all that. Since most people choose their social networks because of friends, family, work, things like that, however, it does mean that the ability to do that is a little bit weakened. Though I know, for example, Facebook allows you to block posts from someone without unfriending them, so that could be one way around that. But the point is, incidental exposure is at least maybe one way to get knowledge and information to people who otherwise wouldn't actively go and seek it out themselves. In this new media landscape, then, there are a lot of concerns about these three questions here. Are new media outlets more polarized? In other words, is new media like cable and internet more polarized, more extreme than the traditional media? Second, do audiences purposefully engage in selective exposure? Talked about last week, there is evidence about that, particularly for strong partisans, but we'll talk about it a bit more this week in relation to new media. And then finally, if people are selectively exposing themselves to pro-attitudinal information only, what implications does that have for politics? So we'll be looking at these three questions. So the first, polarization in the media. I've had you read Diana Mutz and Soberaj before, and they both have content analysis in their books that I didn't have you read that show that new media outlets such as Fox News and MSNBC are much more polarized compared to traditional news. So Diana Mutz rates how uncivil the media is. And the most uncivil media tends to be political shows. So almost in the sense of the more the show is focused on politics, the more uncivil it is. From, your Jon Stewart Daily Show type things to your Hannity's or Rachel Maddow's. While more general shows like, say, The Today Show usually aren't very uncivil. Berry and Soberaj, in their book, specifically look at political media and routinely find that partisan media engages in hyper-partisan and outrage-inducing rhetoric. So like that Tommy Lauren clip I showed you guys the other week. And this is especially strong in talk radio and cable news. So yeah, new media, especially partisan news media, political news media in general, very heavily polarized, very heavily uncivil, and is in many cases specifically designed to induce outrage over other emotions. What does that mean in terms of selective exposure? So again, first got to talk about, do people engage in selective exposure? And strong partisans usually do make some effort to engage in selective exposure in their media consumption. So strong partisans, people who strongly identify with a party, routinely or consume pro-attitudinal news sources. Web traffic between websites is routinely to other ideologically similar sites. So let's say you go on to The Blaze and there's an article. That article very likely is citing an article from another conservative website. Or if you go on to Daily Kos and they're talking about something and they're linking to another post somewhere, they're probably linking to another liberal website. So ideological news sites routinely link back to other ideological websites. That's how you get this chain, for example, where something starts on a smaller blog, very hyper-partisan blog, and then almost like a game of telephone gets shared amongst other ideological blogs until it becomes a big news thing within that ideological sphere. Partisans do seem to engage in curating their social media networks to seem mostly pro-attitudinal. So, for example, during the election, you might block posts from family members who are supporting a different candidate than you. And what is the impact of this? So what are the impacts of selective exposure? Jennifer Jarrett and Jason Barabas, who are in the Stony Brook department, have a paper on this. And what they find is that Democrats and Republicans, because they selectively expose information, learn about information at different rates, dependent on if the information is pro or counter-attitudinal. So ideological news sources are generally going to push information that favors their side. So a Democratic website or a Republican website is going to post information that's pro their party and anti the other party. And so people are very good at learning about things that are favorable about their own party and negative towards the other party, but they're much slower to learn the other way around. In other words, they're much slower to learn about the good things the other party has done and the bad things that their party has done. But most of the research in terms of if this is a purposeful thing, though, seems to suggest that people aren't consciously and actively trying to avoid counter-attitudinal information. In other words, people aren't actively avoiding counter-attitudinal information so much as people are just naturally drawn to pro-attitudinal information. So if you provide people counter-attitudinal information, oftentimes they will read it. It's just you have to give a bit more effort to do so because, it's just not your natural inclination to go read something that disagrees with you. And then again, we've talked about incidental exposure before. But in terms of the larger political environment, the impact is again going to be muted by the fact that most people just aren't actually actively consuming political content. Where it could be a concern, however, is if the people who actively read political content are more involved than people who aren't, which is a very strong possibility. possibility. The impact could be disproportionate to the amount of people who actually do this. So if activists and political elites are engaging in this more than the average person, and as I've talked about with like sophistication before, it's a very strong possibility they might. The impact could be larger than the number of people who actually do it. So that's just one thing to keep in mind about the argument that its impact is muted by not a whole lot of people do it. Remember, first week, one of the difficulties of media effects is that oftentimes elites, who are a small part of the population, might be the most strongly affected, and that's very hard to catch in research. So, what are some of the differences between old and new journalism? So the first off is that a lot of old journalism is kind of playing catch up to new media sources. So a lot of older news outlets have begun shifting a lot of their work to online. So your local town newspaper, for example, might have a website. And there's actually some newspapers that have completely stopped printing traditional newspaper and have shifted all of their content to online. And this content is pretty similar to what the traditional news has offered. So analysis that I've looked at the newspaper versus the website generally show that traditional news media's offerings are pretty similar. So the shift in medium hasn't dramatically changed what they offer. And a result of this is that a lot of the traditional media is still the major driver of content. What the new media sources, like the internet, have mostly done is just offer a new venue of distribution. So in other words, your big drivers of your news, still biggest providers of news, are still like AP Newswire and New York Times and Washington Post. It's just the internet has offered new avenues of distribution than just relying on, print and ink. Furthermore, social media hasn't quite completely eclipsed traditional media, and in fact, in many cases has become a supplement. So first, Twitter, Facebook, and all that has been a way to do real-time reporting. So in other words, instead of having to wait for the article to be written, journalists can report on news as it's happening. This is especially big on civics journalism. We'll talk about it in a bit. It's also meant there's less pressure from traditional media constraints. So being able to go on social media and do posts has allowed for journalists to do things that maybe wouldn't fit in a news article as much. So you can think of, for example, Twitter threads where post a bunch of short little statements to kind of come up with a thought or an idea or report on something, but isn't necessarily something that would maybe fit in an article. And there's less pressures there in terms of the economic pressure. So social media has given a bit more freedom for journalists than the traditional news article. And Twitter is often both a source of, sources and potential stories. So going on social media, you can get information from social media. So a crisis is happening, and you have citizen journalists or people who are on the scene doing video and reporting information, and you're a journalist, you can keep an eye on the Twitter feed, for example, and use that information to inform you for your story. And also, based on what's trending on social media, you could get information on what people are interested in, what are potential stories that could be talked about. So social media and new media in general, has kind of become more of a supplement than a full-on replacement for traditional media. One of the big examples of something that new media has allowed, however, is more citizen journalism. So Jay Rosen here kind of defines it in the sense of when people formerly known as the audience employ the press tools they have in their possession to inform one another. In other words, the idea of citizen journalism is that people who would primarily be consumers of news can now make news. In other words, you don't have to sit and wait for the news to come to you. If you have the time, ability, and resources to do it, you can go out and create news yourself. And one benefit of citizen journalist is it offers a greater variety of sources and viewpoints and develops a greater sense of engagement. So you can see that, for example, in the picture I have here is from the Arab Spring in 2009, where social media served as a major tool of news and organization for the protests. And especially since a lot of official media was getting shut down or was heavily censored, it was the main way that people within the country and outside of the country could get news about the protest and what was going on. But one of the problems about citizen journalism, though, can be is that a lot of citizen journalists don't have a lot of training or a sense of professionalism. And so citizen journalists can oftentimes be a source of misinformation. So an example your book mentions is from the Boston Marathon, where people looking at pictures, taking pictures, falsely reported a potential suspect that, caused that person a lot of grief and also wasted the time of the police. I mean, the real suspects, the people actually, who did it, did eventually get caught. But that's just one thing you have to be careful is that, eyewitness and untrained professionals oftentimes may not be in a position to provide good information, or there's people who may engage in misinformation. So you might have read, for example, during the 2016 elections or even now, reports on individuals who take advantage of social media sites and the ease of creating websites to create fake news sites specifically for the purpose of making revenue by purposely writing inflammatory, eye-catching, ideologically extreme, outrage-based news that then gets quickly shared, brings in a lot of ad revenue, but is essentially complete junk. So citizen journalism has a lot to offer in terms of providing new viewpoints and new sources, getting, really good on-the-ground information. But you have to be careful about making sure that the information is good. Another growing source of news and information are blogs. So one of the things that blogs have sort of become is this mixture of news and commentary. Like a lot of those ideological news sites I posted in the syllabus are technically blogs. And a lot of the bigger, more well-developed, more influential blogs, a lot of the people on those blogs have similar backgrounds to traditional journalists. So they might, in fact, have been journalists or have gone to journalism school, but chose to use blogs instead of other media avenues to do their job. And a lot of blogs are also personal blogs. So in other words, they're not tied to the pressures of, having to make money and profit. So they're personal blogs, personal interest, nonprofit oriented. And so this gives a lot more time to focus on advocacy journalism and critical analysis of things mainstream media may not focus on. So you go to a blog and you might get a lot more information and a lot more detailed analysis of an event that mainstream media might not have, because the person who runs that blog is just really interested in that topic. And some of the results of blogging is that blogs have some agenda setting power. So a lot of news stories might break out of research or analysis conducted by blogs, but there is the potential that blogs might cover something too much, and so the media doesn't feel the need to have to cover it more. But blogs are getting to the point that they can control the agenda somewhat, not to the extent of traditional media or cable news, but it's enough that it can get some attention on an issue. And that mixture of commentary and news means that it's more engaging for partisans, though it can maybe cause more cynicism or distrust in traditional news or institutions, depending on how the blog presents itself. But, getting people more engaged is at least one benefit of that more commentary, infotainment type stuff. That's a big point Mutz makes in her book, but just again, there are some downside in terms of trust and perceptions of legitimacy and things like that. Campaigning, of course, has evolved quite a bit since the introduction of new media. So I have, for example, there a picture of the Bob Dole and Kemp 1996 online campaign website. You can definitely see 20-something years later, campaign websites have changed quite a bit and have in fact become essential to campaigning now. Like, if you're a candidate and you don't have a website, I will personally judge you as being a bad candidate. I will admit, I have judged candidates on the basis of their website quality, particularly, in terms of being able to get information about issues and things like that. And they are now also a main source of, well, they're not a main source. Traditional fundraising is still a major primary source of money, but they are a major way by which campaigns can solicit funds, recruit volunteers, and develop communication networks. So Howard Dean in 2004 was one of the first to really use and take advantage of the internet for fundraising during his primary they run in the 2004 Democratic primary. And Barack Obama in 2012 and Bernie Sanders in 2016 really showed that you could effectively run major campaigns. Well, Obama still used a lot of the traditional fundraising, but you can run a major campaign and really take advantage of the internet as a source of funding. With Bernie Sanders' campaign almost entirely run by money from donations from supporters. There was a few PACs here and there from, like, I think Nurses Union or something like that, but it was mostly funding from donations, a lot of which came from the website. Social media has developed a way for candidates to interact more with the supporters. So a lot of social media has been developed by the campaign to encourage people to share information and engage with the candidates. So a lot of candidates and politicians have Twitter feeds, email lists, Facebook, things like that. And if you're interested in that, I don't have anything from the book because I just read it in the library a few years back and it's not my thing. But there is a book by Parmalee and Bichard, Bichard, called Politics in the Twitter Revolution that goes more in depth about social media and the impact, particularly of Twitter, on political relations with candidates and their constituents. So if you have an interest, I might recommend that. A lot of campaigns have also started developing apps to sort of gamify, helping the campaign into a game. So during the election, I signed up briefly for Ted Cruz's app to get a look at it, and you had leaderboards, you had achievements. Hillary Clinton's campaign app you could decorate a room with things you unlocked using points you built up by sharing information, doing quizzes, donating money. So apps are quickly becoming another way for the campaigns to organize. Canvassers have apps to help them doing their job of knocking on doors and canvassing, things like that. So apps, another new development on how campaigns are using new media to become more organized and to try to reach out to voters. In terms of the internet providing new ways of doing democracy, however, expectations have not really been met. So a lot of people thought there was a potential for a sort of digital democracy where using the internet you could get around maybe traditional political organizations. So you can think of this in terms of like the Sanders or Howard Dean, where instead of relying on traditional political establishment, you can go around it using social media and your website and email list and all that to reach out to people directly and build sort of an independent campaign infrastructure. That's not really what's happened, though. If you're talking within the traditional political venues, such as a presidential campaign, the traditional infrastructure, the parties, still your best bet. If you want to run for president, you have to run through a party. And the parties have started adapting to this new technology as well. So if you thought that, this technology gave you a benefit over them, no, they've adapted to it or are adapting. Just parties are meant to elect candidates. That's what they do. A lot of the production and readership of political information is still mostly political elites. So digital democracy has not led to a new renaissance of the average person becoming informed. I said earlier, it's more entertainment options. So if you're not interested in politics, you can just not pay attention to it, essentially. And like I said, traditional organizations have found ways to take advantage of this media. You have, for example, the concept of astroturfing, where major political organizations, lobbyist groups will take advantage of social media and connections and things like that to sort of seed the grounds for a grassroots movement by donating money, tech support, organizational support to develop these movements. But what the digital age has sort of helped, though, is that it has reduced the cost of organization. So in other words, it's much easier to organize now using social media than it was in the past. It doesn't take that long to set up protests anymore. It's like an event can happen and you can have a protest within the next day or two, or even that evening if a lot of people organize on social media fast enough. And this allows for coordination and information outside traditional media. And I have, for example, this video here about the role of social media in protest in Hong Kong in 2014. And I'll let you watch it.
Yesterday, my friend Mr. Hong, the head was broken, but the video is in Facebook.
So everyone is recording this?
Yeah. This is a new trend in Hong Kong. If some accident, don't call 999. Use the phone to take a photo or take a movie.
Wherever you go in the Occupy movement here in Hong Kong, whether it's in Admiralty, whether it's here in Causeway Bay, whether it's in Mongkok, you'll see everyone with their smartphones out the entire time. They're either communicating with other people, trying to get information about what's happening, or they're recording stuff. From their dog sitting on a protest poster to recording someone getting beaten up. This is a movement that has been entirely coordinated on social media.
When the internet is down, we will use this file chat, use the Bluetooth to connect around
Everyone
here.
who's in the area can use their Bluetooth to connect to each other. Yes. Okay, so what are these people saying?
They're arguing to stay in Jinbashi or not, and then some resources to translate to which station.
Oh, so the occupiers are literally having debates on fire chat about whether to... That's amazing. So everyone can see what's going on.
Yes.
That's very democratic. You don't use fire chat?
Yeah, I don't use it.
Why not?
Because I think some of them are fake.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some of them are fake. For instance, there are some messages that we block the road and cause traffic jam, and so some pregnant women cannot give birth to the baby in the Wan Chai Hospital. But actually, in the Wan Chai Hospital, they don't serve the pregnant women.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's a lot of rumors there. Also, it's not very user friendly. Yeah, it drains the battery too fast.
Telegram, Facebook, what do you use?
Mainly Facebook.
Why do you use that mostly?
It's most convenient.
Do people put out appeals on Facebook for people to go to Mongkok and protect the students?
Yeah, sure. You need to calculate the risk anyway. So if maybe I'm stronger, I go to Mongkok.
Facebook, there are so many pages about this movement, and I would only believe the messages from the scholarship of the Hong Kong students.
In Facebook, also we'll have bad information. In WhatsApp, also we'll have bad information. We must consider what the news is real. Although the network is down.
Typical.
But as you can get a sense from it, how this media can provide information and allows for coordination in ways that are easier and more accessible to people outside traditional political venues, outside of traditional media. Especially in Hong Kong's case, you're an individual living in a government that is more in control of the media, more authoritarian control systems. This allows you to sort of get around traditional media, provided the infrastructure for the digital systems are still in place. So again, one of the things to remember about engagement, though, is that new media is not a cure-all for engagement issues. Engagement is still mostly conditioned on political interest. If you aren't interested in politics, you won't be engaged in politics. But the new media, particularly internet, has allowed for new ways of getting people engaged. So the main pros is that online news content favors interactivity in communities. So comment sections, forums, chat rooms, message boards. The new types of media available really favor getting people in a position that they can interact with one another. Granted, not always the most civil, and that's one of the cons there, is that a lot of this content may be low quality or inaccurate. But as I've talked about, for example, with Barry and Soparaj, much of the success of the outrage industry has been the cultivation of these type of interactive communities that bring people together and develop a sense of identity with other people who watch the show. Furthermore, social media, search engines have begun embedding news, have increased the ability for people to be exposed incidentally. So even if you're not someone who actively consumes media, a lot of the internet organizations, social media, have been working on ways to try to keep people informed and engaged with politics. Facebook in particular, in the aftermath of 2016, has been really looking at trying to figure out how to get people engaged and informed while dealing with that issue of the low quality and accuracy of a lot of information that might be pushed out on social media. But you still have the concerns, though, is that a lot of this media is still very heavily fragmented. That, in other words, you have a very fragmented market with everybody kind of going in their own ways, and that this can contribute to polarization. People get caught in their own little social networks and information information bubbles, and that can also cause knowledge gaps, like the differential learning of probe encounter attitudinal information talked about earlier with Jarrett and Barabas's research. So people can get more engaged thanks to new media, but there's a lot to be said about making sure that what they're getting engaged with is accurate and doesn't contribute to other issues in politics. And that's sort of where I'm going to leave you for this week. Like I said, this is a very easy week compared to the others. There's no quiz, but you still have a short paper discussion board thing to do. So I wish you luck with that, and I will see you, figuratively speaking, for next week's lecture